Hey guys, this video is for APUS. If you have not watched the video I left for you yesterday, please stop watching now and go back to that one. And remember to watch it from start to finish. And after you do that, then come back to this one and watch. But let's just try to keep the sequence. I know a lot of you probably have watched yesterday's videos, but if you haven't, go back and do that now. Then after you finish, come back and watch me again. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War. Now, we kind of laid the groundwork for it in the last video, which is why it's important to go back and watch it. But I just want to spend a lot more time, or at least a lot more depth into what happened. Like, how did the Cold War begin so soon after the Second World War was over? The Cold War was the defining aspect of American life for almost half a century. It explained so many other things that were going on in the country that might not even seem related to Soviet relations, but actually were. Um, the paranoia, the resurgence of conservatism, the fear of communism, hot wars, Korea, Vietnam, a total direct change in American foreign policy to one of active interventionism. And the list goes on. And constant fear of nuclear war. So the list can go on and on about like all the things that how the Cold War profoundly changed American life. But let's talk now about how it all began. Now, Winston Churchill, we'll talk about this toward the end of the video, but Winston Churchill gave a speech in 1946. He was out of office. He was actually defeated for re-election as Prime Minister of Britain right after he led Britain to victory in World War II, which many people think is the height of ingratitude, but the British people, I think rightly, felt that Churchill was not the man to kind of lead the country through the chaotic peacetime transition in British society, and they decided to go with the Labour Party and with Clement Attlee, who personally I think is is the greatest British prime minister. But that's a whole other discussion. But Churchill, as an ex-prime minister, visited the United States and gave a speech in Missouri at Westminster College, where he described the situation in Europe as an iron curtain descending across the continent. And I'll leave the link to that speech in the bottom of this video. But after that, that term "iron curtain" came to describe the division between the free Europe and communist Europe. The Iron Curtain that was separating the West from the East, the democratic from the communist, the Iron Curtain. Now, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in many ways bound to be in conflict with one another. The only reason, like, why they were working together during the Second World War was because they had a common enemy, right? The Germans, right? So the U.S. and the Soviets joined forces to defeat the Germans. But that wartime partnership would not last in peacetime, and in many ways, it was inevitable that it would not last. Many factors influenced this deep cool that developed in relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. One is that Western Europe was ruined and exhausted by the war. And they were in no position to take up the mantle of leadership. The Brits, at least for a while, tried to maintain a lot of their empire around the world, but with mixed to poor results. India actually got their independence in 1947, 2 years after the Second World War was over. So Western Europe was in a really, really bad position, ruined, physically ruined. Their economies wrecked. So it was the United States that really had to step in and assume leadership of the free world. Eastern Europe was ripe for takeover. Eastern Europe had been taken over by the Germans during the beginning of the Second World War, and then the Germans pushed in, and then when the Russians pushed back on their way to Germany, they took control over Eastern Europe. Also, the world situation was profoundly different after the Second World War was over. Not just in the obvious ways, right? Germany was defeated, Japan was defeated, the U.S. is now ushering in the era of Pax Americana, where the American value system and American military might pretty much pulled the strings of the entire free world. So it changed in that sense. But also, other countries around the world, outside of Europe and Africa and Asia, those old colonial empires were crumbling. The English Empire, the British Empire, the French, empire. And as those empires were crumbling, they kind of became battlegrounds between whether they're going to adopt a more American model of governance or whether they're going to adopt a Soviet model, or whether they're going to try to take a middle route, a third route. The term third world, which now, is synonymous with, you know, poorer countries. What that actually means is a country that did not take sides between either the Soviets and the United States. And usually those were poorer countries, which is why they call poor countries the third world. But that term actually has a political connotation, not just an economic one. So the world was changing profoundly, but at the heart of why the Cold War began is a deep, unabiding hatred, and I will use that term, hatred, that most Americans felt toward communism, right? Which of course is the system of government in the Soviet Union, and one that they were expanding as they were taking over Eastern Europe. So why? Let's answer that question. Why does the United States hate communism so much? And almost instinctually, hate communism. Basically, communism is the opposite of everything the United States represents. Even when we don't always live up to those principles, we still feel that, the essence of being an American is believing in certain principles. And the communist philosophy could not be more different than you know in every possible way from the American way of life. There's no democracy in communist countries, right? The United States believes in democracy. The United States believes in elections, right? That we should be able to pick our leaders. There's no civil liberties in communist countries. You don't have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom to protest your government, things that we pride ourselves on as Americans. You have the right to go and criticize your government whenever you feel like it. Basically, complete government control over the lives of the people, right? Very, very repressive in almost every way. American society kind of prides itself on, being a free society, where the government is there, but, certainly does not try to control your life. Government control over business in communist countries. There is no private enterprise, no private business in communism, right? America's essence in many ways is capitalism, right? Is the pursuit of wealth, right? Is business, private business. We're capitalists, right? And not only that's not just incidental part of the American, DNA. It's an integral part, right? Being a capitalist society. Communist countries, of course, are not. That's why they're communists. And of course, there's no religion allowed in communist countries. Communism is atheist, right? And in many countries, it varied by degree by the different communist countries. But some were looser on it, some were stricter on it. But communist countries really do not allow the free exercise of religion because religion is seen as a threat to the state, right? The United States is a very religious country, right? From our founding, right? And even if individuals personally might not be religious, we believe as Americans that everybody should have the right to practice their religion, whatever that might be. So on almost every possible level, everything that the communists believe is unalterably opposed to what Americans pride themselves on believing. Now, that's why for a lot of people, the Cold War was existential. It wasn't just like, we'll just have, we're not getting along with the Soviet Union, just like we don't get along with this country or that country. It wasn't like that. It was an existential question over which way of life would ultimately prevail. A free society based on democracy and capitalism, or a repressive society based on government control over the political and economic lives of its citizens. So the Cold War in many ways was different than different beefs that we've had with countries in the past. This was an existential thing for a lot of Americans. Communism could not be tolerated. And Americans hated communism viscerally and also feared communism and worried about what the growth of communism around the world would mean, not only to the world, but specifically to the United States. And because it was seen as a threat to everything the United States felt it was about. Now, after World War II was over, the United States decided that it had to do whatever it could to stop the spread of communism. Now, this is what happened after the second. We'll help if I have a map, but after the Second World War was was over, well, not even when it was over, but during the course of the Second World War, in the last couple of years of the war, the Soviets, remember the Germans attacked, here's the Soviet Union, here is Germany. Germany attacked the Soviet Union, right? And the thing is that ultimately the Soviets pushed back and lay their way into Germany. But as they were pushing back, they swept through Eastern Europe and they took control over the countries of Eastern Europe. These poor people, right, in Eastern Europe, they had basically been conquered by the Nazis, right, as the Nazis were making their march to Russia. But now the Russians, by going toward Germany, was taking over Eastern Europe themselves. So the people of Eastern Europe were basically pawns, right, of first the Germans and then the Soviets. And the Soviets took control over Eastern Europe. So those are the countries of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania. I know I'm leaving one out. So they basically took control over these countries. Now, their argument behind taking control over these countries is they needed a buffer zone to protect themselves from Germany, right? You know, that they're attacked by Germany. They lost 25 million people, Russians and Soviet citizens in the war, and they needed some protection against a resurgent Germany. Would Germany really resurge, though, with the United States really in charge of Germany? You know, that's a whole other question. But deep in the Soviet psyche was this, was this fear of German expansionism. Also, a lot of the Soviets, were like, we deserve Eastern Europe. We are the ones who bore the brunt of the fighting in the Second World War. We lost tens of millions of our citizens. And the United States and other countries do not have the right to tell them that they can't take over Eastern Europe. So the thing is that a lot felt it was a reward that they deserved. Also, some Soviets interpreted Yalta as being an affirmation of their right to control Eastern Europe. I refer you back to my Yalta video when we discussed this, but that's not exactly what FDR was intending to do when he signed the Yalta Agreement with the Soviets. But some Soviets conveniently interpreted the Yalta agreements to mean that we had permission to take over Eastern Europe. Soviet puppet governments were installed throughout Eastern Europe, and their promise, speaking of Yalta, they promised at Yalta that free elections would be held in Poland. But the directions and the promises to do that were so vague and wishy-washy that basically the Soviets just installed communist governments in these countries, set them up, and then when elections were finally held, these communist governments were the ones that approved what candidates could run. So, of course, they're not going to approve non-communist candidates. So there was all a giant sham. So basically, within a few years, Eastern Europe was completely under the control of Soviet Russia, of the communists. And what would the United States do about this? Now, President Truman had a very different idea about communism than, well, let me not put it that way. Sorry about that. President Truman had a very different conception of the way that the Soviet Union had to be dealt with. Now, President Truman was a liberal Democrat. He was a New Dealer. Very similar domestic policy views as Franklin Roosevelt, in fact, more liberal on some, particularly on racial issues. But Truman was a hardline anti-communist. It was deep in his DNA. And he had no intention when he became president of coddling the Soviet Union. He wasn't really saying explicitly that that's what FDR had done, but he was saying that, well, that's not what I'm going to do. And he did not believe that concessions should be made to the Soviet Union as they were expanding into Eastern Europe. He refused to give them economic aid after the Second World War was over, which perhaps was, maybe not the best move politically, in terms of, or I should say politically, diplomatically. But he believed that communist expansion could not be tolerated. It had to be stopped. And now the Soviet Union was making their way into Eastern Europe. But at the same time, Truman, like FDR, was a Wilsonian. He was a believer in the United Nations. I know a lot of Democrats. He was a Wilsonian. He believed in self-determination. He believed in the ideas of the United Nations or the principle of the United Nations. So it wasn't like his views were, just like right-wing reactionary nationalist views. He held fairly traditional progressive beliefs on many things, but at the same time, he was a hardline anti-communist, as were many other progressives. I remember I had a student years and years ago who actually asked me the question, well, he was a liberal Democrat, but he was anti-communist. How could that be? Well, of course it could be, right? Because at the forefront of opposition to communism in the United States often were liberal Democrats. They called them Cold War liberals, right? Because a lot of liberals said, well, communism is the opposite of everything we believe in as progressives, as liberals. So many hardline anti-communists in the United States government actually were liberal on other issues, not just President Truman. Also, there was a personality difference between him and FDR. Truman was a lot more combative than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was very suave and always kind of felt like he could play the diplomat and could try to like smooth things out between the Americans and the Soviets. Could persuade Joseph Stalin to move a little bit more in our direction. Truman was going to have none of that. Truman was not going to, in his words, baby the Soviets. So that's why history is fascinating, right? Oftentimes the course of history is changed just by people's personalities. And that wasn't the only factor, but it was a factor behind why the Truman policy was so different than, well, I won't say so different, but seemed different than FDR. One of the biggest what ifs for those who study 20th century U.S. history is, what if FDR had won the election? Well, he did win the election. What if FDR had survived and did not die in 1945? Would the Cold War have happened? Would he have, pursued as hardline a policy toward the communists as Truman later did? Of course, we can never have a definitive answer to this question. And on the one hand, we see FDR was more conciliatory toward the Soviets, but during his presidency. But remember, that was during the war, right? When we needed the Soviet Union a lot more. So what would have his policy have been, once the war was over? It might have been profoundly different. And in the book I read a few weeks ago, FDR actually, a few weeks before he died, actually commented that the Soviets are breaking every agreement that we made with them, and I don't think that we actually can, proceed the way we've been doing. I think we're going to have to be a lot more assertive in dealing with the Soviets. I didn't know about that. So it's possible, in fact, I'd say likely, that FDR also would have pursued a pretty tough policy if he had lived. But again, many people on the left disagree with that, but they're basing it on his policies during the war, which was a completely different context, right? We needed them to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. The Soviets held a deep mistrust of the West. One of the biggest reasons is because they're communists and we're not, right? But another less philosophical reason why the Soviets distrusted the United States so much is because we did not open a second front in the Second World War until 1944, right? Remember, until D-Day. So that meant the Soviets were bearing the brunt of the Nazi war machine for years. And there was an incredible amount of resentment about that in the Soviet Union. That basically we hung the Russians out to dry and made them do all the fighting and the killing and be the victims, the main victims of the Nazis, while we kind of waited forever to open the second front. There is some reason for that resentment. If it was up to FDR, I think the second front would have been opened earlier. But Churchill, as we talked about before, Churchill was very resistant to opening up a second front, right? Because of memories of World War I and all sorts of things. So that's why we didn't do it until D-Day, until 1944, and a lot of the Soviets really resented that. And over the next couple of years, a couple of years after the Second World War was over, the Soviets just tightened their grip into Eastern Europe, ultimately extending into East Germany. Of course, that's the country I missed when we were naming all the countries. East Germany. The eastern part of Germany was taken over by the Soviet Union and turned into a communist state. Berlin itself, which is wholly within the Soviet sector of Germany. So East Germany, I'll show you when we'll do this in class. So here's East Germany, which is controlled by the Soviets. Berlin is in East Germany, but Berlin itself is divided between the American sector and the Soviet sector. So West Berlin was this tiny island of freedom, like a this communist dictatorship. That's why it became such a powerful symbol during the Cold War. In February 1946, Stalin said, quote, "There is no lasting peace possible with capitalism." You know, which maybe was stating the obvious, but really disabused anybody except the most idealistic or leftist, that the Cold War was going to happen, right? There was still some hardcore people on the left who were still saying we should try to make it work with the Soviet Union, but clearly even the Soviet Union didn't really think that was going to happen. In March 1946, we started the video by talking about this. Winston Churchill gave a famous speech in Missouri, which is President Truman's home state. And Truman was actually sitting behind Churchill. And Churchill said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe." With the communist countries on one side of the curtain, the free countries, or at least the non-communist countries, the Western countries on the other side of the curtain. And that metaphor stuck and came to describe the Cold War situation for the next 4 decades. There is nothing the communists admire so much, Churchill said, as strength, and nothing for which they have less respect for than military weakness. So the battle lines were clearly being drawn now. And this was all happening only a year after the Allies, which were the US, the Brits, and the Soviets, had achieved this stunning, well, maybe not stunning, but this amazing victory in the Second World War. So this new superpower world was developing. That was a new term, right? The superpowers being the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Cold War, which soon developed, became the dominant force in American life for the next half century. You could say the Cold War influenced American life as much, if not more, than any hot war we ever fought. All right, guys, so that's the end of this video. So remember, hopefully you watch this from start to finish. Hopefully you did the same thing with the last video as well. When we have class on Thursday, we're going to talk about the way the U.S. responded to communist expansionism. Policies that basically laid the foundation, for U.S. foreign affairs for the next 40 plus years. All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Peace.